conversation. And I think everybody is, not everybody of course, but many people are waking up to the problems that are created when you don't have equal access to resources for people who need them.
I just want to add to this part of the discussion was focused on legislation. But there are other much more subtle problems involved in misandry, and sometimes they're very easy to trivialize. For example, I was watching a show on PBS the other night called Antiques Roadshow. I don't know if any of you ever watch it. They have a bunch of people come and they present their household artifacts and they get them evaluated. At the end of the show, they have a very brief segment for several people whose items were not chosen for a major discussion, but they just sort of have their final word. So one woman brought in a portrait of a man, and I guess it wasn't a particularly good portrait, so she didn't get a high evaluation. So what she said was, and this is a perfectly nice little lady, there was no ranting, nothing. She said, well, like all men, it's worthless. And you see, in itself, this is trivial, this is meaningless. But when you have a culture in which this kind of joke is pervasive and acceptable in polite society, then you have a problem because you have certainly boys trying to form a healthy identity and they keep getting this in their face. And so I think that though it's more subtle than legal problems, it needs to be taken seriously.
No, interestingly, of course, obviously we've got a number of examples of misandry, but a lot of men just don't take it seriously. They don't take misandry seriously, and in some cases, even when you put examples right in front of them, they'll literally just outright ignore it.
Well, Catherine might have something to add to this, but my experience, the men, at any rate, who are most likely to dismiss it are what I would call alpha males. In other words, these are men who can afford to be complacent. They have jobs. They have, there's nothing immediately threatening them. Now, of course, if they are suddenly hauled into divorce court or they have to fight for custody of their children, that's another matter. But if you can afford to be complacent, I think most people choose to be complacent. Other men, by definition, alpha men are a very tiny minority of the male population. So other men, people who are either out of work or they're doing menial jobs or they have no skills to offer the labor market, they're uneducated, they're dropping out of school, whatever. These are the people who are more vulnerable and they can't afford to be complacent. But even then there's a problem because for them to acknowledge that they are in fact vulnerable is basically to deny the entire edifice of what they were taught was masculine. Being masculine is basically being in control of yourself, not being vulnerable, being able to take care of yourself, and actually being able to take care of others as well. So, and this is a heavy emotional investment that every boy growing up must make. You have to break away from the sense that you are in this nice, cozy, safe home. You have to go out into the larger world, and you have to make yourself invulnerable to the kind of things that will impede your success. Okay? There is complacency. I'll tell you though, complacency is eroding very quickly.
Well, obviously, the fact that we're having discussions like this at all is some very strong evidence. The fact that people are talking about it means that people are starting to notice, and more importantly than just noticing it and keeping it to themselves, they're actually looking out and saying, hey, this is what I'm seeing, are you seeing what I'm seeing? And it turns out a lot of people, when they hear that, say, yes. Oh, crap.
One of the places that they're finding stoicism very detrimental to men is in the field of health, because men don't want to complain about their health. They don't want to go and ask for help. And therefore, male stress is often undiagnosed. There's all kinds of medical problems simply because if you're in control and you're in charge, then you don't need help. And the medical profession is now waking up to the fact that men and women approach the issues of health and the medical system very differently. People who have worked with people who are grieving counselors, now know that dealing with women and men in the context of grieving, partially because of the stoicism that men have been enculturated into, is a problem. But then to say men should just become like women and, be emotional and whatever, if that's that definition of being a woman, I'm not ascribing to that. But that leaves an identity problem for men. So it's between a rock and a hard place.
There was a study that was conducted maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I can't for the life of me think of the name offhand of the researcher. But she basically wrote a book on, she interviewed hundreds of men who were in the process of getting divorced. And she was trying to find out how divorce affected them. And she found that the language of suffering or grief had been what she called feminized. In other words, the research that had been done was looking for signs of grief that would be most applicable to women. So she had to try to invent a new vocabulary that men could recognize and then say, yeah, that's what I'm feeling. So, this problem is, it transcends any academic discipline. You find it everywhere.
Now, you brought up identity several times, the masculine identity crisis, all of these things. Everybody knows what identity means in a general sense, but you're using it in a very specific way. First, can you talk a little bit about why men do need a positive identity as agenda? How is this separate from personal identity, and what makes it so important?
Well, I think that, first of all, personal identity and collective identity are very closely related. By collective identity, let me go back. Identity is basically about deciding in what ways you are like other people and in what ways you are like. If you're like other people in every way, then of course, by definition, you can have no personal identity. But if you're unlike people in every way, then you're truly marginalized. So the process of forming an identity is always a balance. Yes, I'm like these people in some ways, but I'm also like those people. And we all carry, certainly in a modern society, a complex society like ours, people have several identities. I'm gay, I'm Jewish, I'm an academic, all of these things are parts of my identity, but none of those is my entire identity. But in terms of sexual identity, I would have to say that there might have been a time when people didn't need to have that, at least not consciously. But because women have found a need to establish their own identity, then by definition, men have no choice but to do the same thing. So just as women decided that they were not going to allow Freud or Jung, men, to define who they were, men have also got to do the same thing. They've got to do this homework themselves. Women cannot define men. And that's a process that men will simply have to go through. They have to discuss it. And one of the purposes of a men's center, I would say the main purpose, is not so much to mobilize people to march in the streets for rights, but rather to talk about what it means to be a man. What is the experience of manhood about it?
Well, I would also say it would be to bring together good academic research and to make it available so that people are educated and they can take part in these kinds of discussions in a knowledgeable manner.
When you spoke about feminism earlier, one of the first times it was brought up, you used the term ideological feminism as opposed to egalitarian feminism, and you referenced feminist ideology. Can you talk about that word particularly, ideology?
Well, we wanted to do two things. We needed to give a name to a phenomenon that we would see, and we wanted to to distinguish it